To be honest, I couldn't be more comfortable with the title of this conference. As you'll hear, it hits on a lot of the primary responsibilities and my areas of focus at HHS. My only concern, as I've been told many times, is I'm standing between you all and a happy hour. So I'll try to be concise and brief in my remarks, but as you heard, leveraging technology to advance coordinated care is combining health, law, and technology, so it's incredibly simple, so we should be able to breeze through things pretty quickly. But as you heard, as you can see, I'm the Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary and a Senior Advisor to the Secretary at the Department of Health and Human Services. So I've been told that those titles in some of our limited bios don't provide a lot of clarity of what we actually do or what we focus on, or even kind of what HHS is for a lot of people. So I wanted to start just by providing a little bit of color on those areas. As some of you have already heard today about HHS, one of my bosses was here, so now that he's not, I can tell you the true story about him and everything going on there. So as some of you have heard, HHS is one of the largest government organizations in the world. 80,000 employees, a $1.3 trillion budget. I think you all know we regulate 20% of the economy through the FDA, pay for 30% of healthcare. We have the largest R&D shop in the world, in the National Institute of Health. We also have a 200-facility healthcare system in the Indian Health Services. We issue over $100 billion in grants, and I found out when I started there, we also actually purchase over $25 billion annually worth of goods and services. And so I share that just as a little bit of background on HHS, but I also think it's a fair indication of the level of complexity of it, that it is that the area that we all work in and kind of what we do and what we have to deal with. Now, as far as my roles as the Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary, I support the Deputy Secretary, Eric Hargan, who spoke earlier today, on strategy and policy development and the day-to-day operations and management of the department. For those of you who heard his talk, he's the Chief Regulatory Officer and the Chief Operations Officer, and his main goal is to provide policy direction and execution within the department. And so some people ask, why Chief Regulatory Officer? But really, if you think about it, the government does two things. We issue regulations and set left and right limits, and we deploy capital through grants and other things. And so it kind of makes sense that the Deputy Secretary is the regulatory officer, because that's the real products that we push out. But so, as you know, if you were there, this Deputy Secretary has a particular policy and strategy focus on deregulation and deburdening to accelerate innovation. So a lot of my time in the Chief of Staff role is spent on CMS, FDA, Health IT, and some CDC issues, as I'm sure you're aware of the regulatory impact and activity, as well as what they can do for innovation in the sector. But I think you might have all seen his passion for regulatory reform is constant. And so we stay pretty busy with the regulatory efforts across the department, trying to push deburdening, deregulating to drive innovation. From the operations and management side, we focus our efforts on the same things I'm sure all your organizations do: building the best teams, improving customer experience, using technology to its fullest potential, and ultimately setting up the organization for success. So my other title, as you can see it in governments, there's titles, it's crazy. But in the title as Senior Advisor, I'm the Senior Advisor for Interoperability and Health IT. And so there I specifically oversee the work of ONC and some of the components of FDA that really focus on health IT. And I'm also responsible for the internal departmental efforts regarding administration, finance, and how we use technology as a department. So using things like natural language processing and AI to analyze our contracts, so we're better stewards of taxpayer dollars. So it's a nice balance operationally, but also policy-wise. But in this role, my responsibilities are more specific to those organizations and their specific goals, like interoperability or personnel management, and driving those efforts there through the department. So this includes things like budgetary development, and as I mentioned, using technology for our business within government. Prior to this, I was at a large health insurer and had a software company before then, but hopefully just to provide a little bit of background on HHS and some of the roles that I play, so you can understand what I'm sharing with you and where it's coming from. So you might be asking, well, why are you here sharing with this group? And at HHS, our mission is to enhance and protect the health and well-being of the American people. As I mentioned, we're a large organization with significant resources, but one thing that we absolutely know is that we won't succeed in our mission without relying on patients, providers, technology companies, suppliers, and everybody else within industry to help us achieve and improve the health and well-being of the American people. So for us to be successful, we have to work with our partners, but we also need to be clear on how we're pursuing our mission. So selfishly, my goal with being here with you all today is to speak with you and share HHS's vision for healthcare, which the Deputy Secretary touched upon earlier, but focusing specifically on interoperability and leveraging data to achieve our mission. So I hope this will help you understand where HHS is driving things in a little bit more detail on the interoperability efforts, and provide you with some specific areas where we see opportunity or where we'll really be relying on industry to drive some of the things home. But as the Deputy Secretary touched upon, it's first about communicating our vision. And as you know, HHS has a particular vision for healthcare, an affordable system with personalized care, and a system that puts patients in charge and control and provides high quality care at the lowest possible cost. So we believe a system like this will provide patients with the affordability they need, the options and control they want, and the quality they deserve. Delivering on this vision requires protecting what works in the system, but fixing what's broken. And I think it's important to recognize this is not all that unique of a vision for healthcare, whether you think about the triple aim or others. A lot of people are aligned in pursuing this type of goal. Now, critical to achieving this vision is for patients, providers, and all stakeholders to be able to make decisions at critical times and to make the best decisions at critical times. This requires having complete and accurate data and information as much as possible. This, we all know, requires systems and tools that hold the data to be able to work together, exchange at ease and quickly and in real time so that these decisions can be made. But also known as the term that we've used a lot, right? We want these systems to be interoperable. But like our vision for healthcare, our desire and vision for interoperability isn't all that unique. And it's one of the reasons I want to focus on it here is because we're really focusing on providing access to the data so it can drive technology and tools to build. But as I said, interoperability is a key point of this. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, our vision not being unique is evidenced by the fact of what's known as the 21st Century Cures Act, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation almost passed unanimously. And it's the genesis for a major component of our HHS interoperability efforts. Generally, the Cures Act requires EHRs to use APIs to share healthcare data without special effort and prohibits providers, health IT companies, health information exchanges, and networks from blocking patients from receiving their data. But in addition to patients being able to access their data, I think we all agree it's important for providers, caregivers, and others servicing patients to be able to use the health IT tools that allow them to provide the best possible care, to help them best achieve their mission in delivering care without excessive costs or technical fees. And in pursuit of these interoperability goals and in following the Cures Act, HHS has issued 2 notice of proposed rulemakings from ONC and CMS about a year ago, which I'll discuss in a little bit more detail. But this effort at HHS aims to leverage and advance interoperability and to be able to leverage technology and data across the healthcare system to empower patients, facilitate better decision making, lower costs, and so much more. But I wanted to share a little bit more specifically on the rules, and I know the Deputy Secretary touched on them at a high level, but I thought it might be helpful with this group to get a little weedy as it's specifically focused on care coordination and technology. But as some of you may know, the ONC proposed rule, as I mentioned, aims to provide patients access to their electronic health information the same way that we manage the rest of our lives today, through our smartphones in real time. At the forefront of this rule is the patient's ability to get their data. And a fundamental component of that is that these rules, and for the protection of the patient, requires the patient's request and consent for their data to ever be shared. Specifically, though, these rules propose EHRs to require the adoption of APIs, as I mentioned, to facilitate the exchange of information. and implement the provisions on information blocking. Now, this sounds great, but I think this group knows the challenge of technical implementations, adopting new standards, and people adopting technology. And in the rules, to reduce and hopefully minimize some of those uncertainties and to increase the rate of adoption, we've proposed to adopt commonly used industry standards such as HL7 FHIR API for the sharing of data, as well as developing a common data set known as USCDI to set a baseline of known data standards and sets as a starting point so we can start sharing information and really allow patients to create longitudinal health records. In addition to these very, I'd say, specific and technical components of the rules and proposals, we implement the information blocking provisions, as I mentioned. If you're familiar with the Cures Act, you know it just broadly prohibits practices that may be information blocking. So everything under the sun, from charging a price for sharing data all the way to having a licensing term, could theoretically be considered information blocking. And the penalties are severe, as I think the Deputy Secretary mentioned, of up to $1 million per instance for IT developers, networks, and exchanges, but also with disincentives for providers to be determined in future rulemaking. So because of this broad exception and very, very potentially harsh penalties, we spent a lot of time thinking about what should information blocking be and what are the exceptions to information blocking. And at the front of mind in these questions was privacy and security of patient data and wanting a thriving, innovative health IT ecosystem. And so with keeping those in mind, we developed a broad term of what information blocking was so that people could use the tools they need as well as get their data, but also make sure that certain practices were approved. And that's why the exceptions to information blocking we included in the ONC rule included things like privacy and security practices or infeasibility, as well as things like reasonable costs for products, as well as reasonable and non-discriminatory licensing terms. And we think all these things are going to fit in the right way that it'll protect patients' data and allow them privacy and security to encourage the use of data, but also allow people to have the economic incentives in place so they continue to develop innovative products and develop healthcare solutions. So in this, we proposed the rule about a year ago, and we received over 2,000 comments, and I think there were something like 10,000 pages. And so with that, we take very seriously the comments we hear from industry to achieve our goals, and we've been taking those into consideration in the drafting of the final rule. We've also had extensive in-person industry collaboration to hear what's really needed to do this, what are the right timelines to implement the technical requirements or have the right business practices. So we take these engagements and comments very seriously when drafting the final rules, and specifically hope to get them out very quickly, as I said, to accelerate people having access to their data in a quicker manner and making better decisions. In addition to the ONC rule, and being driven from Cures, CMS issued what's called a Patient Access and Interoperability Rule. And this rule is similar in nature in that we're proposing payers to adopt the same technical standards, whether it be the APIs and the data sets, and being required to share those information components they have with patients as well. We really think it's the right move to use the same standards both from an API point as well as the data set, so you can start to have that data be mapped very easily and quickly to provide a real longitudinal health record and start cross-checking, what your clinical record says with claims and giving as much data as possible to the individuals. In this rule, we also propose to require providers and hospitals to share admission, discharge, and transfer episodes to primary care physicians and others that need to be made aware of if a patient is having a healthcare engagement. And so these are just another huge step in what as I say, creating a longitudinal health record and really having the patients have access and control of their data, as well as letting providers use the data and put them in the tools that they think are best to help them deliver care. So, one thing that we talk about is this: it's a lot of technical components and accessing the data, and these rules are about ensuring patients have access to the information about their health and healthcare information and provider tools. But I think when we're talking about this, we're talking about real-time access to medical records. And this has been an effort years in the making, but just having access to the data isn't the goal here. right? The goal is improving health and changing lives, as you've seen a lot of presentations today on how people are trying to do that, whether it be through care coordination or other ways. So in thinking about where we really see opportunities for this and what we're driving for, and thinking about the data sets, personally I can say, like as a parent, as a relatively new parent, I look forward to the day to where I can actually pull up my children's immunization records, because I seem to be badgered about that anytime I want to take my kids somewhere. But really having that is just something I'd love to have on my phone. And that's just a frustrating experience, I think, that a lot of people can relate to, whether that be for immunization or my risk-tolerant daughter's occasional visit to the ER. So that's just one of the experiences where I think having that data at hand could be helpful. Now, not being able to get access to your records, even though knowing somebody else can, is a tremendous frustration for patients and providers, no matter how well-versed they are. I think the secretary recently spoke at an annual meeting, and he was trying to get his records, and he said the one thing that was of comfort is there was no special treatment. Even the Secretary of Health and Human Services has been waiting 2 months to get some records, some of his healthcare records. But as I said, that's a frustration. But beyond the frustration, this also proposes significant health risks. I'm fortunate to have healthy kids, but I shudder at the thought of not being able to remember the allergy of one of my children in a healthcare episode under stress that could have life-altering consequences that could have been prevented if I was able to access the record in real time. Or take my aunt, for instance, who has multiple medications, retired, travels to Florida, had a healthcare episode in Florida. She's on 8 medications. Nobody knows them. She can't remember them. She's in the hospital waiting to figure out how to be treated because they don't know what her medications are and they can't get access to them. The story ends up okay, but I think we've all heard stories to where it doesn't end up in a positive status, and that's just another situation to where patients having access to their medical records and being able to combine them in ways that are understandable and presentable, we think has a real impact. In addition to the health frustrations and the risks, there's also a lot of costs associated with having a lack of access to this information, and this data can really lower the cost of care. We always try to use personal examples because we're subject to HIPAA violations as well, so we're just unexposing my healthcare record, but what can you do? But when I moved to DC about 2 years ago, I had to get blood tests. Well, like anybody else, you've got to figure out, before you can actually read the blood test, you got to have a baseline. So for 3 months, I spent time for 9 months, I got 3 blood tests because that was faster than pulling my healthcare records back from an Illinois provider. Now just think about the costs that are associated with just that situation and extrapolate that of anybody who moves or switches a doctor. And so, we think that's another example to where access to data is so critical. Now, these are minor examples, but we think they're real opportunities in healthcare to make improvements in cost, quality, and just patient satisfaction. So the one other thing that I wanted to talk about was how does this fit in with the other efforts at HHS? These rules will advance our goals towards interoperability systems and we think really help address some of the healthcare anecdotes that I shared. But I do think it's important to note how it's also driving into every other effort that we have, access to data, use of technology and information. As you know, a recent executive order required HHS to propose rulemaking to require hospitals to make available actual prices that they've negotiated and prices they're willing to pay from patients paying cash. Now, if you think about this, having access to that pricing information as well as your clinical history and starting to actually see what you've paid, what your options are, where you should go, it really is a transformative option. I mean, I always think it's amazing that I can get my whole credit history to a bank and get approved for a $400,000 mortgage, but I can't pull back and find out, what time I went to what hospital and what test I had. And so we think combining those two things are really critical in transforming the healthcare industry. And this is possible with some of these efforts being combined. Additionally, you heard about the Deputy Secretary's regulatory sprint to coordinated care. And I think he probably said, it's legitimate in government when there's a hashtag or an acronym. And if you ever have the opportunity to join government, make sure you have one or it's guaranteed to fail. And it has to be somewhat catchy. And that's the best we could come up with. But But as you heard with the sprint, it's about creating space for innovation and allowing new creative models as well as accelerating access for information. So even in conjunction with our interoperability rules, we talked about sunsetting the EHR donation time period. We've talked about expanding to allow cybersecurity tools to be provided and donated to ensure not just that information is shared, but it's private, it's secure, and having that information is going to flow into the new business models, delivery solutions. And so just another way that the sharing of information and use of technology flows into those. You can also look at our CMMI models to where we're pushing providers to take on risks, all sizes of providers and different levels of risk to develop comfort. Now, if you're going to do that, providers also need to figure out how to manage patients outside the face-to-face interaction. And so what they need to be able to do, whether it be through remote patient monitoring or advanced tools or telehealth, is to communicate with patients and understand what's happening. And that's where we think additional sharing of information can have a really significant impact on giving providers a different level of comfort when thinking about taking on risk for patients and allowing them to focus on health outcomes as opposed to billing for procedures. Now, working towards these goals can deliver a completely different kind of healthcare system, where, as I said, the patient is the center of it and they're in control with seamless access to data. But so I do want to kind of briefly close and hopefully sharing, so what can you guys do? I've just shared a ton of stuff we're working on. A theme from the Deputy Secretary's office that we get ingrained in is never miss an opportunity to put people to work, especially if you have a microphone. And so, I'd like to just close by refocusing on our vision at HHS, because it's important if we're all driving in the same direction, we can figure out the right steps. And as I said, it's a patient-centered healthcare system that provides high-quality care at the lowest cost possible. And we really think transparency, the adoption of technology, and increased access to data will really drive us in the right direction. So I encourage you all to think about how these efforts will impact the missions that you take on and the services you provide. Whether it be thinking about how customers are going to start demanding different things when they have transparency or understand their record. How providers might have to have different conversations or solutions to deliver the best care. Additionally, I think you have to get technical. We're talking about technology, so if you don't understand HL7 FHIR or what's in USCDI and these data sets that are going to become more available at patients' direction, you need to start understanding what those are and where they can either have a point of influence or point of information to make the right decision, both from patients making decisions, but providers. And lastly, I think the thing you've got to do is engage. We're out here because we want to hear and see what's going on in industry, but we really rely on industry to help inform us on our proposals and engage in the regulatory process, provide comments, and reach out even through informal channels to educate us on what you're doing and where you're seeing success. As someone who's had to read thousands of comment letters, I can tell you the process is taken very seriously, and we get a lot of good insight from it. But I'll leave you with a thought that when I look at everything happening in healthcare and people talking about leveraging technology, data, advances in AI, and even just focusing on the patient and coordinated care, for instance, it's really exciting to see how many people are focused on this and how much people realize the opportunity is to provide a better healthcare experience, improve healthcare outcomes, and really lower costs. So I thank you all for the work you do and providing encouragement for all of us in the work we do. But I think I have a little bit of time for questions, if there are any.
Thank you. That was very, very informative. I'm Julie. I'm from New York, so I have the pain of not having a lot of interoperability. I actually have two diverse questions. One is, as probably everyone knows, in Europe, they have cards in the age of technology, like a credit card that has all of the patient's medical record information, and we all know that it's best if the patient owns their information. Has there ever been any thoughts or attempts to create that kind of a card in America, where you can swipe it and the health history comes up for the patients, particularly Medicare, Medicaid, where you can potentially have one platform? So that was my first question. My second question is really quicker. Is this going to apply the prohibiting holding information? Is that going to apply to private physician offices who we are now, I can tell you in New York, dealing with when physicians lose patients, they make it impossible for the patients to get their information to the next. So those are my two diverse questions.
I'll take the second first. Yes, so the information blocking rule is applicable to all providers and then certified health IT developers and information exchanges. So any provider who is blocking could be subject to information blocking if they don't provide access to their information, if they're not sharing it with the patient. So yes, it's broadly applicable. And so on the first question, there's discussion, and I think I'd correlate this to the unique patient identifier, whether it be a card or a number or something. And so there have been discussions on that, but in fact, there's a statute that blocks HHS from creating or even thinking about creating one called the unique patient identifier. And so there's been some new discussion on that. But so from the government standpoint, it's not something we've pursued. But I think it is interesting when you do talk about that, whether it be creating a number or a card. If you look at everything that's happening in authentication and identity validation, I think there's a question of whether one ID is the right thing or whether you use multi-factor authentication, whether you use multiple sources to validate identity. And so I think it's a fair question. What I'd hope is that when you open up access to this data, you use multiple things, multiple points of access and multiple data points to ensure you know who it is and you cross-check. And I think that's a more secure and even strategic way of doing it than somebody having one card or the other. Medicare recently switched to what's called the Medicare beneficiary ID because people were stealing Social Security cards, and right, there's already a concern about fraud about the MBI. So, there's a little bit of discussion. HHS doesn't kind of pursue that, but I will say when you see, like I said, how other industries have elevated security through innovation, I wonder if it's the right thing is to develop a framework for security as opposed to a specific point and let people keep evolving to combat kind of the things that come with identity theft and other things like that. I get it, there's a happy hour.
While having this data interoperability, it is important then when you're looking for immunization record, then that's what you should get. Not a whole bunch of 700 pages of the data which they have on your file. Because if we give too much data, then nobody reads it. So I don't know how far the industry has gone to select this out.
Yes, so I think there's, with what we do, we work within the statute. And so one, as I mentioned, the CURES has a broad term, electronic health information, which could include everything under the sun. What we've tried to do is take a kind of I'd say a two-pronged approach of here's a data set that people understand, right? You'd be able to find an immunization record in these 23 data set points, right? People know what they are. It's a standard that's been adopted. So let's have a starting point to work with, right? And these are things people know. But then also we want to say, we want this to evolve and grow. There's more data points than we can, map, tabulate, and even name. So we also don't, want to limit it to a static data set that's going to change as you think about risk scores for diabetics starting to include, scan retinopathies as well as A1C levels and family history. So in our proposed rule, we try to develop something that's going to allow an evolution of what the data is and share it and create an enforcement environment that encourages innovation without limiting access. But to your point, there's always, there's a lot of data out there, so we've tried to have a technical starting point with a data standard that people understand and allow it to continue to grow. I think on your point of, finding a needle in a stack of needles, kind of what you're saying, there's a lot of data out there. I do think the first thing is liberating the data and letting people have it and the innovators and you all will develop the tools to make sure the consumer is getting what they need when they need it, and they're not distracted by a bunch of white noise. So I think that's one of our fundamental things is we're not going to choose the app or the data. We're going to create a platform, a regulatory environment that pushes the data out there in a secure, protected manner, and let people deliver the solutions to the consumers, patients, and providers that best improves health.
One of the important purposes from the consumer point of view to have the data is to get a second opinion without undergoing repetition of all that work of the child. And that can only happen if the discharge summary is specifically printed out of the data. Every patient get admitted in the hospital or in the emergency room, they get doctor dictating discharge note. And that covers everything about the patient.
Yeah, so USCDI.
And that out, and one patient under that.
So yeah, USCDI includes clinical notes and things like that. So.
My name is Pedro, with the VA, and wondering how this is going to affect, as a government agency, we have our own system, of course, and we work DoD, and so we have, I think it's called Joint Legacy Viewer, which is where we can access everybody's information from around the world. I can see anybody, if you go to a Virginia VA, I can pull it up in Houston and look at it when you come to see me. So my question is that going to be, I guess, married with a civilian system so that they can pull up our records as well? You know, they pull up VA records to see a patient in the private sector, or so that we can see private sector information when they come to see us and ask us for, medications, because some patients do see both. So I'm wondering if that's ever been considered, or if that's being considered to combine the two systems like that.
Yeah, so I think the thing to go back to on that is it all starts with the patient. So the patient has the ability, from this, the patient will have the ability to access their electronic record, and then they'll be able to share it and provide it to the provider, whether it be the VA or whether it be a private system. So they'd be able to pull that, and if they want to compile it in whatever application system, or maybe they don't want to do it at all, they can, but it's at their consent and direction. And so it's not going to give the VA or a system the right to go ping a Nova Fairfax, right? But they will be able to say, go to your doctors, gather your health record. When you come back, it'll be more helpful, and the patients will be able to do it quickly through real-time electronic standards.
I have another VA question. I used to work at the VA, and the medical record system, it wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. And my understanding is that, anybody could use it if they wanted to. Is that correct? Or, could any private health system use the VA's medical record system? The structure itself, not the data, but the...
So I work at HHS. My understanding is the VA's EHR was homegrown.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if they've ever licensed that out or offered it to people. I think one of the things that that's unique about the VA is it's a consolidated system.
Mm-hmm.
And so even healthcare systems that use the same EHR don't necessarily share data. So that's why, information blocking, it's not about using a system, it's also about practices and the business practices you do. So I think, but like you said, that's my understanding. I might be off. Well, thank you all very much. I hope this was helpful and provides you a little bit more information on HHS, but thanks for all the work you do as well. So thanks again.